The following program is a production of KSPS TV.
Few men have had as much action in their lives as Theodore Roosevelt. His name conjures up images of big game hunting, Rough Riders, the Panama Canal, glasses and a grin, speak softly, carry a big stick, and more. Images that make him seem larger than life. But he was not simply an icon of his time. He was a very real man who touched the hearts and minds of very real people. At the beginning of his second term, when he stood in the White House and shook hands with 7,000 fellow citizens, newspapers called him the most popular man in America. His critics termed him that damned cowboy, and a prime example of Americanus egotisticus. He was a devoted, happy father and husband, yet his years were torn by tragedy. His presidency was the first that could be called imperial. Theodore Roosevelt often ignored Congress to pursue his vision of the country's destiny. He was the first media-conscious politician the nation had ever seen. His picture was everywhere. His likeness appeared in countless cartoons. His quotes passed from citizen to citizen, and his activity, filmed for posterity, flickered from every screen. He used the Oval Office as a bully pulpit to preach the virtues of vigorous physical activity and social reform. He bellowed against corporate greed and crooked politicians. He was, in short, a pistol, or as his enemies pictured him, a loose cannon. But he often hit what he aimed at to the cheers of almost every American. Theodore Roosevelt was born in this bed, October 27, 1858, in New York City. That same year, a peasant girl in France claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to her, and in London, a company was formed to dig the Suez Canal. Roosevelt's father, Theodore Sr., was the scion of a long-established line of Dutch merchants. His mother, Martha Bulloch of Georgia, was considered one of the most beautiful women in New York. While beyond the family walls, the nation ground slowly toward civil conflict, Teedy, as he came to be called, grew up in safe and sheltered surroundings. A necessary environment, considering his fragile health and a frail body subject to ominous attacks of asthma. He was so sensitive, his father bought him a velvet-covered chair, the horsehair upholstering of regular furniture irritating his delicate skin. One of his favorite memories of the house in New York centered around the parlor. The Sunday evening family gathering was the redeeming feature in a day which otherwise we children did not enjoy, chiefly because we were all made to wear clean clothes and keep neat. The ornaments of that parlor, I remember, included a chandelier decorated with a great quantity of cut glass prisms of peculiar magnificence. One of them fell off, and I hastily stowed it away, passing several days of furtive delight in the treasure, a delight always alloyed with fear that I would be found out and convicted of larceny.
He was surrounded by total adoration and love from his siblings who adored him, and his two sisters worshipped him, and his parents, and he was sheltered. Because he was ill, he couldn't go to school, so he didn't come into the contact with rough boys of his own age, really. So he was in a kind of hothouse environment.
When the Civil War erupted, the household divided, as did the country. T.R. Sr. was staunchly Union. His wife, true to her Georgia background, actively supported the Confederacy with money and supplies. While Theodore Sr. never served in the military, he hired another man to take his place. He was in action behind the scenes.
I think the divisions in his household over the Civil War affected him deeply. I think it made him realize that you had to make moral choices. I think he realized that early on. He loved his mother, and he had greatly admired his Confederate uncles. But as far as he was concerned, they were wrong. He always spoke of his uncles as being very brave men, but being very reactionary men. To him, the right side, the progressive side, was the Union cause. And to him, that meant giving your all. And he never said that anything about his father's war record. Obviously, his father had not taken part in the war because, he found it difficult to take up arms against his in-laws, and it would have been unbearable to Mrs. Roosevelt.
He spent most of the war, as I understand it, involved in various kinds of things. Perhaps the most notable was that during the Civil War, soldiers were paid directly in cash on the front, and very little of the money tended to flow back home to their families and wives. And so there was a very serious situation where wives and children were having difficult economic troubles, and the soldiers on the front were gambling the money away or spending it or whatever. And T.R. Sr. and others saw this as a problem, and they spent quite a bit of time lobbying Congress and various other government agencies to establish a system where soldiers could sign papers that would allow a good chunk of their pay to go directly to their families.
Perhaps young Theodore's most vivid impression of the war was the death of Abraham Lincoln. There's a photo of the assassinated president's cortege passing T.D.'s grandfather's home in New York. The future president is believed to be one of the two boys in the upper window looking down on the solemn procession. Lincoln was to become one of Roosevelt's most admired national leaders. Those years of conflict and family division had little effect on the boy, except perhaps to foster his feelings of ambivalence toward some situations. He carried on with his studies and developed a deep love of nature during summers spent on Long Island with the family. Romping in the meadows, fishing in the bay, collecting specimens for his assembly of what was called by the family the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History.
Robert Barnwell Roosevelt, an uncle of T.R., himself had written books about wildlife, and fishing and hunting. T.R. could read his uncle's own books. He had the influence of others like his uncle who were very, very interested in the subject matter. T.R. was a naturalist, you might say, who skinned the specimens and saved various bugs and birds and so on that he got out in the forest, and was lucky enough to be able to leave the city. But he had a laboratory in their home on 20th Street in New York, and his room stunk regularly from all the chemicals that he was using. So it was a passion of his since boyhood.
Young Theodore was exposed early to the world at large. His father took the family on extended trips to Europe and Egypt. He was given his first shotgun and used it often to shoot birds for his museum. By this time, his love of hunting was not just a pastime he enjoyed, but a part of his being. Under his father's urging, he began a strenuous regimen of exercise to build muscle on his slender frame. By the time he entered Harvard, T.R. was a sturdy young man in a great hurry and completely devoted to the vigorous life, an ideal he long held aloft to the public. During his years in high office, stories of his campaign to correct the weakness of his youthful body inspired thousands of skinny boys to follow his example, just as his political career would serve as a model for his cousin, Franklin.
Amateur sports he loved. He was one of the founders of the NCAA. He loved amateur and particularly intramural sports and village sports to keep the hard edge.
During these growing years, Roosevelt began to spend falls and winters in the woods of northern Maine, pursuing his nature studies, hunting, canoeing, and tramping the wilderness, with two new friends, William Dow and Bill Sewell. rough, reliable, outdoor men who would play a large part in his Western experience. In February 1878, 2 years before young Roosevelt graduated Harvard with honors and married beautiful Alice Lee, his father died at the age of 46. T.R. was deeply grieved by this premature loss of the best man I ever knew.
T.R. learned early from his father a very strong sense of morality. His father was a middle-class, fairly wealthy middle-class man, but had a very strong sense of morality and what was right and what was wrong.
Since T.R. belonged to a privileged class, he could indulge himself in social and intellectual activities far removed from ordinary men. He read a book a day, learned several languages, and involved himself in clubs and parties. He also made contacts that would serve his future ambitions to be a politician. During August and September of 1880, with brother Elliot, already a first-class hunter, Roosevelt traveled to the Midwest for some bird shooting. He wrote home that the two of them had bagged more than 400 of several different species, and included a few comments on the individuals they met. The farm people are very rough, but I like them. Like all rural Americans, they're fiercely independent, and indeed, I don't wonder at their thinking us their equals, for we look as badly as mortals can, with our cropped heads, unshaven faces, dirty shirts, still dirtier trousers, and cowhide boots. And he did like them. More and more, he came to admire the average American for their hard physical work, their common sense. In the coming years, he would seek out the support and thinking of such men. At 23, he was elected the youngest member of New York State's legislature. His energetic battles for reform against corruption and special interests earned him a reputation as the Cyclone Assemblyman and made him a pain in the side of the establishment. He divided his time and intensity between New York and Albany, between his new wife and his newly espoused mistress of politics. He also began to plan for the construction of a home at Oyster Bay on Long Island. Early in September 1883, with his wife happily pregnant, T.R. indulged his long-held desire to hunt buffalo. He had heard stories of their wholesale slaughter and felt he had better go quickly before family responsibility made it impossible and before the real West disappeared. Just that year, Buffalo Bill Cody had organized his Wild West show, a sure sign the frontier was rapidly coming to an end.
In Roosevelt's time, the American West was already world-renowned, and there were many aristocrats who came over from England and Scotland and continental Europe and elsewhere in the world who wanted to go hunting and have these grand adventures. And Roosevelt got to know some of these people, and being in New York City, even then the center of activity, you might say, for North America and communications and so on. He happened to meet a fellow named Gorringe, G-O-R-R-I-N-G-E, who was an ex-naval officer, and this man knew a lot about ranching and hunting in the West. He inspired Roosevelt to take a serious interest in going out and looking into all of this, and in his typical fashion, T.R. did his research, and ironically, when he did go out there, Gorringe couldn't go with him.
So T.R. went alone, but in style this time. He had his Western outfit specially tailored, his rifle handcrafted, and his knife fashioned by Tiffany's of New York. He would appear a four-eyed Eastern dude, but would turn out to be much more.
That Roosevelt played the dandy, but at the same time there was an admiration for the costume. It was ridiculous, but yet if I had the money, I'd like to have a Stetson like that one that Theodore Roosevelt had. I probably can't have that sort of knife that was made at Tiffany, but, gee, isn't it the very epitome of what a hunting knife should look like? This phenomena of the West being captured by its own image, that some of the readers of Western dime novels were cowboys themselves, and they were consciously trying to play a role. And so too was Roosevelt.
He arrived at the tiny town of Little Missouri, Dakota Territory, shortly after the Northern Pacific Railroad had completed its span from Duluth, Minnesota, to Tacoma, Washington. There were only a few clapboard buildings scattered about a hamlet long since gone and replaced with the settlement of Medora.
And he arrived late at night, perhaps midnight or so. The train pulled up at Little Missouri, and he got off. It was a very small town, a town whose existence had really only required because of the railroad building. It was not clear that the town was going to survive, and there were some very interesting people there. This was the Old West of the type that we see in the Western. In the morning, T.R. decided that, or knew that he had to find a guide, and so he wandered around looking for a fellow. He found a guy named Joe Ferris. Now, Joe Ferris was a Canadian who had not too long before arrived there and was really interested in ranching and other things, and didn't like T.R. at all. He took one look at this Eastern dude and figured that the last thing he wanted to do was go on a buffalo hunt with some effete Easterner who was of doubtful moral character because of his glasses.
Things began badly. The weather turned foul, few animals were seen, and his guide hoped the Eastern dude would be disheartened enough to call it quits.
He commented later to Gregor Lang that bad luck followed us like a yellow dog follows a drunkard.
But Ferris didn't yet know the out-and-out stubbornness of his charge. It took nearly 3 weary weeks on horseback for T.R. to finally drop his prey. The time and effort left a deep mark on Roosevelt's commitment to the natural world.
T.R. talked to one man who said that he had ridden from somewhere in the Dakotas well through Montana, and he had never been out of sight of the bones of dead buffalo, and he'd never seen a buffalo.
The trip had other consequences for Roosevelt. He had long wanted to own land, and he began to think of a future partly built on the romance and business of cattle ranching. He loved the idea of a life on horseback. It was vigorous action, and it seemed to promise a steady profit. After all, the East, rapidly growing in population, was clamoring for beef. He decided to invest in the Maltese Cross operation. The demand for beef was a lure to many investors and adventurers. In 1882, a French nobleman, the Marquis de Morez, seeking his fortune, married Medora von Hoffman, the daughter of a New York banker. With his father-in-law's backing, he came to the Dakota Badlands to fulfill his dreams of glory and riches. He founded the town, named for his wife, a short distance from Little Missouri, and began building. His grand scheme included a meat processing plant, believing beef shipped in refrigerator cars would realize greater profits than cattle on the hoof. He also built a brickyard, stores, and saloons where he could get back some of the money he paid out in wages. He also built a church and a large, comfortable home overlooking his empire. The chateau, as it came to be known, displayed an elegance the locals surely envied. He lived in style, entertaining guests with hunts and picnics. T.R. dined with the Marquis and his wife on occasion, meals that must have sparkled with French wine and intelligent conversation. But the two men, despite aristocratic backgrounds, never hit it off. Roosevelt preferred the company of ordinary people, while de Morez held himself aloof and superior.
He was pompous, he was anti-Semitic, he was selfish, self-centered, all qualities which didn't appeal to T.R. A boaster, a blusterer. T.R. really didn't care for the man.
There have been many stories told about the relationship between the Marquis and Theodore Roosevelt. Some have tried to make this a rivalry. And there are even efforts to try to suggest that Roosevelt and de Moray were about to fight a duel over some support that Roosevelt had given to a local. However, much of this, I think, is written after the fact, trying to contrast Theodore Roosevelt as our person, our American, and the interloper.
The Marquis de Moray's schemes in America would eventually fail with the collapse of the beef market, and he returned to Europe, embroiling himself in new adventures. De Moray was finally slain during a rebellion in Africa. When Roosevelt returned to New York at the end of September 1883, he brought back more than part ownership in a ranch.
One of the things he got, after all, don't forget, when he began his residence in the Dakota Territory, he was already in politics. And he got a new image for himself. And it was very important because being, one, an Eastern aristocrat, and two, an intellectual, a guy who wrote books, these things were not political assets, did not help his image. And now he could say he was a cowboy, and he wrote books about his Western experience and so on. And of course that later led to the Rough Rider Regiment with the cowboys plus the Ivy League athletes. And then as a soldier, as well as a cowboy, his image was set ever thereafter, the Rough Rider suit, the cowboy suit, cartoons of him as governor of New York, showing him as a cowboy. Up in Albany, in his actions, that kind of thing. Very important to his public image. The West gave him the macho look, the democratic look, the American look, the all-American look, which his own background didn't give him.
Just as he was committed to the West, he set his feet on a path to a political career, realizing that it offered the most efficient way for him to achieve what he thought best for America. He stormed the State House in Albany, pressing hard for legislation that would spell reform. His speeches, wrote a colleague, were punctuated by a jaw that stuck out like a six-shooter. On February 12, 1884, his wife delivered their first child, Alice. T.R.'s delight, great as it was, would quickly be cut short. 2 days later, his mother, long in ill health, and his beloved wife died within hours of each other. The loss of his mother was blow enough, but his wife's passing crushed him to the soul. He wrote in his diary, "The light of my life has gone out."
When his wife and mother died tragically on Valentine's Day in 1884, and his life seemed destroyed, it was to the West he went to build up, to recover.
I think his westward movement after the deaths of his wife and mother in the same house on the same day was very important. It was kind of a salvation. I think he needed a physical therapy, among other things, a real change of scene, and a totally different way of life. And he threw himself into the ranch life and lived the life of a rancher out there, far removed from, the scenes that he knew, the brownstone world of Manhattan and the political world of Albany, and immersed himself in it. He once said, "Black care seldom sits with a rider whose pace is fast enough."
By June of that terrible year, with the new house at Oyster Bay under construction, Roosevelt went west once again and threw himself into frenzied activity. He started Elkhorn Ranch, some miles north of the Maltese Cross outfit. His investments would soon total $85,000. Hours on end were spent in the saddle in all kinds of weather. He was indeed a rider trying to outdistance black care. Bone-weary in the evening, he wrote for more hours. Accounts, letters, drafts of a new book on his hunting and ranching experiences. It's a fine, healthy life. It taught a man self-reliance, hardihood, and the value of instant decision. In short, the virtues that ought to come from life in open country I enjoyed that life to the full. And whatever pain existed in his heart over his wife's death, he never mentioned her name in public again. He settled his daughter in the care of his sister, Bamie, and turned his full attention to running for office. His race for mayor of New York ended in failure, but shortly thereafter he married a second time to Edith Kermit Carow, a young woman he had known for many years. It was a decision not made without great hesitation.
He did have such a strong sense of morality and such a strong sense of what was right and wrong that when he finally decided to get married again after his first wife had died, several years after that, he was torn by enormous guilt because he thought it wasn't right. He thought he was being unfaithful to the memory of the woman who he'd loved.
Roosevelt's many journeys west to oversee his ranching interests had resulted in few profits, except in the coin of regard he had gained from the people. Helping to organize the Little Missouri Stockmen's Association had earned him an appointment as deputy sheriff, with the primary duty of settling brand disputes. But with rustling, a steady violation of local law, he found himself, along with Sewell and Dow, tracking down thieves. On one occasion, he spent 13 days on the trail, sporting both a rifle and a copy of Anna Karenina. A photograph features him holding the captured men at gunpoint. But there was no photographer at the scene. The picture was taken with Roosevelt's own camera, and it was taken later with his men posing as the crooks. He was never one to pass up a chance for publicity, even if staged. After all, the electorate back home loved to vote for a hero, and the not-too-distant future would see people in the West empowered to choose their national representatives.
Westerners came to feel that Roosevelt was the model of leader they wanted, more so than some of their own people.
T.R. kept listening to the West. He knew the West, he had friends in the West, and he kept being instructed by them. I'm referring specifically to the primary system, the direct election of United States senators as opposed to being elected by state legislatures, referendum, recall, all of those direct democracy reforms. T.R. later takes them up and champions them. And this makes him seem like a total anarchist in the East.
The winter of 1886-87 was the worst the Dakotas had seen in living memory. Snow and freezing temperatures wiped out 80% of the stock. By spring, only bones marked what was left of the greatest cattle herds the world had known. T.R. closed down his operation, keeping Elkhorn as a hunting lodge, and went east. Early in 1887, T.R., Edith, Alice, and Bamie settled in at Sagamore Hill. Roosevelt loved the place. He had paid $10,000 down and taken a mortgage for 20 more for 155 acres. The house cost more than 17 and was furnished to suit his interests. Animal heads hung from almost every wall, and skins adorned the floors. Even Mrs. Roosevelt's parlor, feminine as it was, sported its share of trophies. T.R.'s office became the center of his professional universe. From it flowed endless words, and to it came a stream of statesmen, hunters, journalists, politicians, and the curious. Everyone was anxious to know what he thought, what he wanted, and what he wanted was action. He wanted desperately to be at the center of things, to rattle some complacent cages, to do some good, and to make his mark on the public mind and the Republican Party.
He liked the spotlight, and there's no doubt that he did. His eldest daughter had a wonderful phrase about him, which was that he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral.
In 1889, he received a fair amount of light when President Benjamin Harrison appointed him to the U.S. Civil Service Commission. For the next 6 years, he served both his party and his concepts of good government. His efforts earned him an even greater place in the hearts of his fellow Americans. His untiring animal energy, his constant pronouncements, made it obvious that Theodore Roosevelt was destined for more than simple agency duty. His name had already been floated about for higher office, but most party regulars considered him a reforming upstart, a man who thought his own opinions better than those of more experienced men. But the public saw more. They saw beyond the intellectual, beyond the party parrot. They thought of him as a man of action, a man who had forged his values in an area that promised each citizen a better life, a new start.
It offered a hope. Now, many people didn't have the resources that Roosevelt did, where he could just come out and buy a ranch if he wanted. But they dreamed. They thought in terms of, if things go badly, I can go out west. So when things went badly for Roosevelt, that was the escape valve, the opportunity to get away from his problems. And in a microcosm, that was the way people in the United States thought of the West, a place of refuge, of starting anew, although be it most people never were able to enjoy the sort of thing that Roosevelt did.
Over the next decade, Edith presented him a rapidly growing family. Theodore Jr. in 1887, Kermit in 1889, Ethel in 1891. Archibald was born in 1894, and Quentin, T.R.'s favorite, in 1897. He loved being a father, but he loved being a boy even more. Mrs. Roosevelt once said that she didn't have 6 children at home, but 7. Time at Oyster Bay was precious, especially after he was appointed president of New York City's Police Board in 1895 and Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897, which required the family to move to Washington. Sagamore Hill would always be home to his heart.
He loved going out camping with the children. And one of the things he did, and apparently did very well, was he used to tell a ghost story, which some of my cousins know, and reluctantly I've never quite learned it. And he would be sitting around a fire near the swamp at Sagamore Hill, and he'd be telling the story about the ghost walker. And evidently it was a scary story, so scary that even the kids who were 14 and 15 had heard it before. They would start getting nervous, and they'd come closer and closer to TR as he was getting near the denouement. And finally the denouement came, and he'd usually by that time have his hands around him, and he'd jump up and give a great screech. And the kids would all jump up and give a great screech. So he had a lot of fun teasing them and playing with them, and he loved taking them on cross-country walks. And the idea was you'd never go around an obstacle. You had to go through it, over it, but not around it.
If the other children came to fascinate the public, Alice intrigued them. The firstborn, she would live the longest and forever be in the public eye with her mischievous wit and sharp dislike for pomposity.
If Mrs. Longworth had a pillow embroidered with one of her favorite sayings, the pillow would be near her on the couch. If you don't have anything nice to say about somebody, come sit here beside me.
And she was, at that time, probably the most magnetic woman in Washington. And I can also remember when she would invite over congressmen or secretaries of various departments. And if they got a little bit long-winded at a dinner party at her house, she was the first one to say, "Shut up, you're making no sense."
When the family was in residence, the big house by the bay was a hive of activity. Something was always afoot. Summers were filled with picnics, games, competitions, athletics, horseback riding, and no one was immune to the infection of mischief. One dinner guest wrote of his experience at the Roosevelt table. "I asked Mrs. R. if we should dress for dinner. She said Mr. Roosevelt always wore a dinner jacket, but that I could wear anything I wanted, as the only rule they had at Oyster Bay was that they had no rules or regulations. I was very hungry. We had soup, fish, fried chicken, corn on the cob, and jelly. There was nothing to drink but water. He asked me if I wanted something, but I declined. I forgot to mention that the fried chicken was covered with white gravy, and oh, so good. But the entertaining of friends and family cost money, a lot of money for the time, and TR was the last one to keep track of finances. He had other things on his mind.
Edith Kermit Carew, the second Mrs. Roosevelt, handled all the money. He was given an allowance, so much cash a day. In fact, when you look at his checks, you see that only his signature appears on them. He's never made them out. They were put in front of him to sign. Mrs. Roosevelt handled the money entirely. His uncles, and then after that, his first cousins, managed his finances very carefully, and no one ever trusted him with money or with investment or anything like that, particularly after the Western venture. And he just made it because, of course, he never made much in the way of salary, having been in public life from the time he was 23 years old.
Early in 1898, Congress declared war on Spain over long-standing discord regarding Cuba and the sinking of the U.S. battleship Maine in Havana Harbor. TR had long advocated American involvement in the stopping of imperialist actions through military means. The Secretary of the Navy told friends he was afraid to leave town for fear his assistant would go to war on his own.
Someone made the comment, "Who ever made us the 911?" That answer might be Theodore Roosevelt.
Roosevelt resigned his position to help form the Rough Rider Regiment. His involvement in the war only lasted a matter of weeks, but it gave him a taste of fire and the opportunity to become a hero in the eyes of Americans when he led his men up San Juan Hill July 1st. In November, he was elected governor of New York. For 2 years, he pressed his personality on the Republican Party with such force, the leadership decided to disarm his energy by nominating him vice president for William McKinley's bid for a second term. Roosevelt felt the office would lead his career up a dead-end street, stating, "I shall probably end my life as a professor in some small college." Yet, as a party loyalist, he jumped into the campaign with typical vigor. Accompanied by several former Rough Riders as an honor guard, he hit the trail west. It was a homecoming, and everyone turned out to see him. By November, he had made some 700 speeches in almost 600 towns to about 3 million people. His popularity was enormous, and stops at Medora, Deadwood, and Points West were held in a 4th of July atmosphere. His manner had changed little. He still thrust his jaw forward at his audience and chopped the air with clenched fists, pacing like a caged lion, preaching the gospel of American virtues and American greatness. On November 6th, McKinley swept to a second term, and a future party regulars felt was all but over. One Republican said, "I feel sorry for McKinley. He has a man of destiny behind him." On March 4th, following McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as vice president. 4 days later, Congress adjourned until December. On Friday, September 6th, William McKinley was shot. A week later, he was dead. And Theodore Roosevelt, at 42, became the youngest president in the history of the nation.
The presidency was a focus, a point where everyone was looking at, and that could provide the leadership, the opportunity for leadership to remake America.
He wasted little time in setting about to do just that. He again lit into greedy corporations he felt unjustly wielded their power to gouge the public. He pushed for health legislation with the Pure Food and Drug Act, then turned his eyes and his actions beyond the Mississippi. He had long recognized the devastation being visited on the country's natural resources. Robber barons had spent years gouging metals from the earth and cutting whole forests with little thought to the future, and the bare legacy new generations would find in the national larder. In 1907, he wrote, "In utilizing and conserving the natural resources of the nation, the one characteristic more essential than any other is foresight. The conservation of our natural resources and their use constitute the fundamental problem which underlies almost every other problem in our national life."
By the time he became president, it was too late to do a great deal of conservation on a large scale in the East. The East had already been lumbered over. So the vast majority of his conservation work was in the West.
Roosevelt pushed Congress to pass the New Lands Act, pumping millions of dollars into irrigation and reclamation projects. Dams were constructed, among them a huge project in Arizona named for him. Canals were dug, enabling farmers who had seen frugal success to turn deserts into gardens. Two of the earliest systems built were those in the Yakima and Okanagan valleys in Washington state. Roosevelt sought out the best minds to guide the government's actions in the field of conservation and resource management. One was Gifford Pinchot, destined to become the first chief forester of the United States and advisor to the president in formulating a policy of setting aside huge tracts of public land in national forests, protecting them from commercial speculation and wanton cutting. It was a policy Western interests would find in direct conflict with their corporate goals.
There was a lot about TR that was a Westerner, but in one way he was not a Westerner, because he saw that natural resources were finite. And unlike Westerners, he did not want to, of the time, he did not want to exploit in an unlimited way the natural resources because he knew they were going to run out. His great enemies in conservation were the people in the West. Conservation never got him any votes.
The Congress, really promoted by the timber companies, were distressed that he was putting so much of the western lands into national forest and the parklands.
And as he began to make more and more forests, these interests began to get more and more nervous that the sources of their livelihood would be enclosed within the national forests, and therefore they could no longer timber and mine.
They passed a rider to the agricultural bill, which was going to prohibit him from doing that. However, if he didn't sign the agricultural bill, it meant that all funding for the Department of Agriculture would cease and desist.
The bill passed and went to TR to be signed. TR realized he had to sign it because it was a critical bill for a number of reasons.
Again, being the clever politician that he was, he came up with an imaginative solution. Luckily, he'd worked very hard with people like Gifford Pinchot, so he had a very clear idea of what areas he wanted to have put in a national forest.
They spread on the floor of the Oval Office maps of those several states in the Northwest, and they spent the next several days, the days he had between the time he received the bill and the time he had to sign it, which I believe is 8 days, after which is a pocket veto, drawing lines on those maps. And at the end of the 8th day, TR issued a proclamation creating 84 new national forests in those several North states. 10 minutes later, he signed the bill. And there wasn't a damn thing that Congress could do about it.
And part of his whole conservation program is purely preservationist. When he went to the Grand Canyon in 1903, he said, "Don't touch it, you can't improve it. Keep it the way it is." He couldn't get Congress to make it a national park, the way it is now. So he made the sides of it a national monument and the bottom of it a game preserve, which took care of it until they made it a national park a good 10 years later.
During his presidency, he put away approximately 230 million acres to the public land. To try to give you some idea of how much land that is, one way to look at it is to say 230 million acres is the equivalent of 84,000 acres he put away every day for every day that he was president.
His remaining years in high office were marked by notable achievements that sprung from his deep understanding of America's growing role in the modern world. England was in decline, and the United States had become an industrial giant, its factories pouring out the goods to support a population bursting with immigrants from Europe. The dreams of manifest destiny seemed a reality of might and deeds. From the White House and from his office at Sagamore Hill, Roosevelt pressed his vision and personality on the world scene. He pushed forward the construction of the Panama Canal, long an American ambition. His steady and secret diplomacy brought an end to military conflict between Russia and Japan, and a Nobel Prize for Peace to himself, the first Nobel given an American in any category. He held the ship of state steady as it steamed deeper into the coming age of technology.
He liked what technology brought in terms of progress, improvement, possibilities. So he always was very ambivalent about technological progress. He felt that way about the West and the frontier. I mean, he fully realized that the cowboy era that he lived through was a passing stage and that he was living at the end of it, and he knew it had to be replaced by homesteads and farms and cities, and he thought that that was inevitable and thought that that was good, but he hated the idea of the West losing the virtues of the cowboy period, such as individualism, heroism, courage, hardihood, self-reliance. Likewise, for the whole country, he was worried that the urbanization, industrialization would make people soft, both physically and mentally, and also morally.
The force of his convictions was so great that his fellow citizens hung on every word, seized on every image, embraced his every move. Hamilton Fish, a fellow reform-minded politician, was a first-hand witness to the power and popularity of Roosevelt during his presidential years.
When he took over, immediately became popular. He appealed to a great many people as one of the strongest people we had for some time in politics, and grew stronger all the time as the people knew him. He was a good speaker, he was strong and athletic, he didn't mince words, he told the truth, he didn't even know how to lie, I don't believe, not very often. He had about everything a man needed to be a great president of the United States.
Nothing he did went without notice. Political cartoonists had a field day. His big, toothy grin, glasses, bushy mustache, and cowboy attitude toward the country's responsibilities and the world situation lent to his constant caricature. He swiftly learned the media's appetite was insatiable, and he fed it a continuous stream of information, not to make news, but to impress on the people his ideas of what policies were in the best interests of all the people, and not just for the present, but for the generations to follow. At the end of his second term, after engineering the election of his chosen successor, William Howard Taft, T.R. left office. He had served long enough. He wanted to spend time at home. He wanted to write. He wanted to go hunting.
The greatest expeditions that Roosevelt went on as a hunter and a sportsman were first the African Safari of 1910, secondly the expedition to the Brazilian wilderness in 1913, 1914. He'd been advised not to go on either one of them. Sleeping sickness they were afraid of, the danger of wild animals, all that sort of thing. After all, he was more or less blind in one eye from a boxing accident in the White House. And certainly after he survived the first safari, the first expedition, when it came to the second one in 1913-14, when he was into his mid-50s and not in the greatest of health, there were those who said he shouldn't do it. And one thing he said to them was he had to go. It was his last chance to be a boy.
He wrote endless letters to friends concerning not only his eagerness to be away, but on the slow evolution of his feelings about hunting. I'm emphatically against game butchery, or any other kind of butchery of wild things, but I still feel not only that there is no objection to a reasonable amount of hunting, but that the encouragement of a proper hunting spirit, a proper love of sport, instead of being incompatible with the love of nature and wild things, offers the best guarantee for their preservation. T.R. had hoped to slip away as a private citizen, but the press kept the story a hot item, pro and con in opinion. Cartoonists had a wonderful time. His great adventure would last almost a year, and he would regard it as one of the best times of his life.
Of all the rifles and shotguns owned by Theodore Roosevelt, easily the finest quality, the most rare, and today certainly the most valuable, is a double-barreled rifle made by Holland & Holland in England. It's the finest craftsmanship in firearms that money could buy in the period, and is made out of exquisite steel. The wood is French walnut, and a special touch here is the gold plaque with the presidential eagle. Underneath it says TR and the date, 1909.
The genius of TR was that he understood that it's perfectly all right to shoot animals and enjoy the sport, as long as you do it in such a way that the animals are going to be able to perpetuate themselves. We no longer live in a world where we can leave the animals totally by themselves. For example, in Yellowstone, there are no wolves, so therefore the elk and the deer will populate to such a point that they cannot, that there's no natural predators for them. Hunting is a good way of controlling or regulating the population, but it has to be hunting done in a fair way and done in the pursuit of a fair chase. And regrettably, there are hunters in this country who don't know what that means. There are people who delight in shooting wolves from helicopters or shooting them from airplanes. This isn't sport, this isn't hunting, this is wasteful, wanton slaughter.
The quarrel over hunting today has to do with moral issues about hunting, as much as it does about the preservation of wildlife. Because, of course, it's been proven again and again and shown that hunting can be done without endangering the existence of animals. Certain things you can't hunt, certain times, and so on. That's all been pretty well worked out in this country, at least. The moral issue is something else. And TR said, of course, if you were a Hindu, that was what he would say. If you were a Hindu, well, then fine. That is to say, if you're a vegetarian and so on. But he was not a vegetarian, and he saw no moral distinction or difference between butchering a cow and shooting an elk.
Well, TR was definitely a great hunter, a great sportsman, the kind of person that sets an example for every hunter in America and around the world. He was not the greatest shot in the world, but he never gave up. He always kept trying.
Somebody once said, "Are you a good shot?" And he said, "No, honestly, but I shoot often."
His South American trip did not go as well. The Amazon heat and dampness sapped his waning strength, but he kept on, despite infection and injury.
Roosevelt used to do things like going bathing in pools where there were piranhas, and the jungle habitat was even worse than what he had experienced in the worst of Africa. And he did have his leg badly damaged, and he really was on the verge of death, even delirious.
Perhaps the thought of a death in the depths of the Brazilian forest appealed to Roosevelt's sense of the natural order. He once wrote that life and death are both part of the great adventure, and that since man's end was to die, he should accept the inevitable and go down to darkness. Although death did not claim him in the jungle, it put its mark on his body. He was to suffer recurrent bouts of fever and infection that caused open abscesses on his legs, but the greatest pain was yet to come. Rumblings of war came from Europe, where Germany was engaged in a campaign to dominate. Roosevelt once again used the force of his personality and international stature to launch peace appeals to the Kaiser.
He probably delayed the outbreak of World War I because he knew how to handle the Kaiser, and he was able to send messages to the Kaiser through the State Department, but messages which were never published. And he'd say very strong things to the Kaiser. The Kaiser realized that TR meant absolutely everything that he said, and the Kaiser would change his position. But TR was smart enough never to put the Kaiser in a position so that he could not back down. And this is the beauty of TR as a politician. He knew how to get things done.
Yet war did come to America, and as much as he hated it, he believed it the duty of every American man to do what he could for his country. He offered to raise a regiment of his own, but the president refused. Age and time had passed him by. His youngest son, Quentin, joined the United States Army as a flyer to fight in France, where the terrible afflictions of battle were brought home to TR for the first time. His favorite was shot from the sky.
This was a terrible, terrible blow to him. I don't think it shook his view and the necessity the war and the necessity for people to fight, but it was personally a tremendous blow. And he had clearly the resilience he had shown, that had shown in his ability to overcome his mother and first wife's death, was no longer really there. He was now an old man, even though he was less than 60. It's clear that he never really did recover.
He loved all of his children, and I suspect, and this is pure speculation on my part, that having felt so strongly that his children and he himself tried to take part in World War I, that when as a result of his own views that one had to take part in what he thought was an important struggle, but as a result of his views, his youngest son died. And I think he felt not guilty about it, but he felt in one way or another he'd precipitated his son's death. And I think it was a terrible blow to him, particularly for a man who loved his children as much as he did.
The great heart was hurt. Despite the public's long-held picture of T.R. as a vigorous, durable man, he began to fade. Melancholia over Quentin quenched his inner fire, blunted his personality's thrust. When his youngest died, the boy in Theodore died. He seemed to find happiness only in the company of his grandchildren. Accumulated illness began to take its last toll. Early in December 1918, he was taken to the hospital. Just before Christmas, he came home to his beloved Sagamore Hill, perhaps to dream of his years in the West. Surely, he had written, our people do not understand even yet the rich heritage that is theirs. To waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so to increase its usefulness, will result in undermining in the days of our children the very prosperity which we ought, by right, to hand down to them, amplified and developed. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, January 6, 1919, Theodore Roosevelt, 26th President of the United States, intellectual, author, cowpoke hunter, conservationist, politician, adventurer, loving father and husband, and mostly little boy, passed from history into legend.